What if the man you loved was hiding the darkest secrets? Lila thought she knew her husband, until one shocking revelation shattered everything. Betrayal, danger, and a powerful criminal empire are just the beginning. Will she survive the truth or become its next victim? Keep watching to uncover the twists that will change her life forever. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Lila Calloway stood at the grand entrance of the mansion, the soft ocean breeze brushing against her skin as she took in the view of the sprawling Malibu coastline. It was the kind of life she had always dreamed of: luxury, beauty, and endless possibilities. But the perfect life was not as flawless as it appeared on the surface. She had met Amir Al-Fayed just over a year ago, at a charity gala in Beverly Hills. He had been everything she never knew she needed: charming, intelligent, and powerful. Their connection was instant, undeniable. Lila, who had spent her 20s building her career as a freelance fashion designer, found herself swept away by Amir's world. He was a billionaire, a man whose name was synonymous with wealth, status, and influence. Yet, despite the allure of his life, Lila had always sensed there was something more to him, something hidden beneath the polished exterior. Their whirlwind romance quickly turned into a grand engagement, followed by an extravagant wedding in a luxurious Malibu estate. It was the kind of wedding that made headlines, the kind Lila had never imagined she would have. She had always been content with her small apartment and modest lifestyle, but Amir had shown her a world where nothing was out of reach. Diamonds, designer gowns, private jets, it all seemed like a dream come true. But even in the midst of this dream, Lila could not ignore the whispers. They started out as whispers from the servants, the subtle glances from the staff as she entered rooms. Then, there were the occasional hints dropped by Amir's business partners. They all spoke of his past with a strange reverence, careful not to ask too many questions but always cautious around him. It was as if Amir carried a shadow that followed him, a shadow that Lila couldn't fully see but could always feel. One evening, after a lavish dinner party filled with laughter and clinking glasses, Lila found herself alone with Amir on the balcony overlooking the ocean. The sun had set, and the sky was streaked with deep hues of purple and orange. Amir, his jaw clenched, stood next to her staring into the distance. "You're quiet tonight," Lila said, her voice soft, breaking the silence. "What's on your mind?" He turned to her with a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking about the future," he replied, his voice tinged with something she couldn't place. "How perfect it will be." Lila smiled, though she felt a strange unease settle in her chest. It was moments like this that made her wonder. She didn't question Amir outright, she was too in love to do that. But there were moments when something didn't sit right. She had seen the coldness in his eyes on rare occasions, a flicker of something dark that would vanish just as quickly as it appeared. The night carried on with laughter and dancing, but Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She shook it off as nothing more than her overactive imagination, the product of her life now being so different from what it had been just a year ago. The following morning, Lila awoke in the grand bedroom of their estate, the golden rays of the sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a new day, a perfect day. But as she stretched out and reached for her phone, she saw a message on Amir's device from an unknown number. It was just a single line, but it chilled her to the bone. "You don't know the truth about him." Her heart raced. Who could this be? Why would someone send such a message? She clicked on the number, but there was no information, no clue as to the sender's identity. She tried to shake it off, thinking it might be spam or someone's idea of a joke. But deep down, she felt a nagging sense of dread. When Amir came in to check on her later that morning, his smile was as perfect as always, but Lila couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. His gaze lingered just a second too long on her, like he was measuring her reaction. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Is everything okay?" she asked, the words leaving her mouth before she could stop them. Amir's expression shifted slightly, the flicker of concern quickly masked by a reassuring smile. "Of course, darling, everything is perfect." But Lila wasn't so sure. The message, the unease, The feeling that something was missing. It all gnawed at her. Was this life really as perfect as it seemed? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? As Amir left the room, Lila sat on the edge of the bed, her phone still in her hands, staring at the anonymous message. For the first time, she felt like she was living in a house of cards, beautiful and fragile, just waiting to fall apart. The morning after the cryptic message, the house felt different. Lila sat at the breakfast table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, staring at the untouched toast in front of her. The warmth of the cup did nothing to ease the chill that had settled inside her. Something had shifted overnight, and she couldn't put her finger on it. But it was there, lurking beneath the surface of the life she thought was perfect. Amir was already at the table, going through his usual routine, looking over the newspaper, his fingers skimming the headlines, a soft frown on his face as he read. He was as composed as ever, but Lila noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped against the side of his coffee mug in a nervous rhythm. It was subtle, but it was enough to make her heart race. "Everything all right?" Lila asked, trying to sound casual. Amir looked up at her, his eyes lingering just a moment too long, as though trying to gauge her. "Of course," he replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Everything's fine. Just work." His words were soothing, but they didn't reassure her. It had been weeks since he had seemed anything but calm, and today, something felt off. She wanted to ask him about the message, but the words got stuck in her throat. Instead, she smiled back, though it felt like a mask, just like his. But as they sat in silence, the air between them thick with unspoken tension, Lila felt the creeping unease grow inside her. She had seen Amir like this before, though never for this long. He'd always been the type to compartmentalize. Nothing got to him. But today he seemed distracted, preoccupied, and it gnawed at her. Later that afternoon, Lila wandered through the house, trying to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She knew she should have let it go, but she couldn't. The message, the strange behavior, the increasing distance between them, it all piled up in her mind, like a weight she couldn't ignore. She passed by Amir's study and saw the door cracked open. Normally, he would have locked it by now, especially when he had something to hide. But today it was ajar, the faint glow of his desk lamp casting a shadow into the hallway. Something told her to keep walking, but instead she hesitated. Curiosity was a dangerous thing, but Lila couldn't stop herself. She gently pushed the door open and stepped inside. The study was immaculate, as always. Bookshelves lined the walls, their spines perfectly aligned. Papers were stacked neatly on the desk, and his computer sat quietly, the screen dim. But there, on top of the papers, was a file, one she didn't recognize. A small leather-bound notebook, its pages slightly yellowed, was partially visible. Lila's heart raced as she reached for it. The second her fingers brushed against the notebook, she froze. The door creaked behind her. She turned quickly, her pulse hammering in her chest. Amir stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was only silence. "Lila," he said softly, his voice low and controlled. "What are you doing in here?" Her hand was still hovering over the notebook, her mind racing. She didn't know how to explain. The lie formed in her mind, but it felt hollow. I just wanted to see you. I thought I'd come find you." He stepped inside the room, his presence filling the space. His eyes never left hers, calculating. For a moment it felt like the walls were closing in, the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. "I see," he said, a slight smile tugging at his lips. But it wasn't comforting. It was forced. "You shouldn't go through my things, Lila." "I wasn't," she stammered, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what she was even going to say. Amir walked past her, his footsteps purposeful, and took the notebook from the desk. He slid it into a drawer without looking back at her. "Let's not make this a habit," he said, his voice cold now, the warmth gone. Lila watched him, a knot forming in her stomach. She knew something wasn't right. She had seen his expressions change before, but never like this. The way he held himself, so rigid, so distant. It was as if the man she had married was slipping away. "I just wanted to know the truth," she whispered, almost to herself. Amir paused at the door, his back turned to her. The truth is what you make of it, Lila. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a dare. He didn't even turn around to face her when he spoke them, as though dismissing her entirely. Lila stood frozen in place for a long moment after he left, her mind spinning. She had always trusted Amir, but now she felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, peering into a darkness she couldn't understand, and the deeper she looked, the more she feared she might fall into it. Later that night, as she lay in bed beside him, Lila could feel the coldness in the air. Amir had already fallen asleep, his breathing steady and rhythmic, but Lila couldn't sleep. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the night outside. She turned to face him, watching his chest rise and fall, wondering if he was really the man she thought he was. For the first time, Lila wasn't sure anymore. The perfect life she had dreamed of now felt like a facade, and beneath it all, something darker was waiting to be uncovered. Lila woke up to an empty bed. The sheets beside her were cool, untouched, a stark contrast to the warmth she'd grown used to in Amir's arms. The first thing she noticed when she opened her eyes was the silence. The house was still, too still. No soft sounds of Amir moving about, no faint murmur of the television in the background, just quiet. She sat up, heart pounding in her chest. He wasn't in the room. She pulled herself out of bed, walking quickly to the bathroom, but it was empty too. Her phone, lying on the nightstand, buzzed. One new message. Her breath caught as she glanced at the screen. "Where are you?" It was from Amir, but the message was sent at 3:12 a.m., and it felt like an eternity since then. Lila had been asleep, not hearing him come in or leave. Her fingers trembled as she typed a quick response. "Amir, are you okay?" There was no reply. Panic crept in as she rushed through the house, calling his name, her voice echoing in the empty rooms. The kitchen, the living room, the study. Nothing. No sign of Amir. She tried his phone again, but it went straight to voicemail. Her mind raced. Where could he be? Why hadn't he come back to bed? He'd been acting strange for days, but this was different. Lila stood in the middle of the living room, the cold touch of fear crawling up her spine. Her gaze swept over the room, and then her eyes fell on the door to the garage. The car was gone. Amir's car, his favorite black Mercedes, the one he always took when he went out. He was gone. And this time, he hadn't told her where he was going. Lila's chest tightened. She ran to the front door, throwing it open. The driveway was empty, the morning light still dim as the sun barely began to rise. She stood there for a long moment, breathless. She tried calling him again, but the phone went straight to voicemail. This wasn't like Amir. He'd never been gone this long without a word. Even when he had his secrets, he always checked in with her, always made sure she was okay. But now, everything had shifted. Something was wrong, and Lila couldn't shake the feeling that it had everything to do with what she had found in his study. Without thinking, she ran back inside, grabbing her purse and keys. She had to find him. She had to know what was going on. The idea of him being in danger, of being out there alone, left her frantic. What if he was in trouble? What if this was something more? The thought of Amir, usually so composed, lost, and vulnerable, shook her to her core. She wasn't sure how long she drove before she pulled into the parking lot of the local bar, one of Amir's regular hangouts, though he'd rarely spoken about it. He only ever went here when he needed to be alone, to think. As she stepped out of the car, her heels clicking sharply against the asphalt, a wave of unease swept over her. The bar was closed, but the back door was slightly ajar. She hesitated, but only for a second before pushing it open. Inside, it was dark, the dim lights casting long shadows over the empty tables. The bar smelled faintly of stale beer and whiskey, but there was no sign of Amir, no sign of anyone. Her heart pounded as she made her way toward the back office, the door slightly open. Inside, there was a man sitting at the desk, facing away from her. The office smelled like cigarettes and something else she couldn't place. The man, dressed in a faded leather jacket, turned at the sound of her footsteps. He looked familiar, one of Amir's old acquaintances, but she couldn't place his name. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice thick with indifference. "Where's Amir?" Lila's voice cracked, betraying the panic she was trying to suppress. He paused, glancing at her for a moment before standing up slowly, his movements deliberate. "Amir's gone," he said, his eyes narrowing as he regarded her. "He's not coming back." Lila felt the words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her legs felt weak beneath her as she tried to process what he was saying. "What do you mean he's not coming back?" she asked, her voice a whisper, more to herself than to him. The man stepped closer, his gaze dark and unreadable. "You didn't know, did you? Amir got himself into something big, bigger than you or I, and now he's paying the price." Lila's blood ran cold. The world seemed to tilt around her. "What price?" she asked, barely able to find the words. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a folder. He slid it across the table to her, the harsh scrape of paper echoing through the room. Lila reached for it instinctively, but as her fingers brushed against the edges of the file, the man stepped back, his eyes suddenly gleaming with something cold and distant. "You should go, Miss Calloway. It's over," he said, and the door slammed shut behind him before she could ask another question. She stood there, holding the file in her trembling hands, but the man's words were louder than any answer could be. "It's over." The truth of what she was about to uncover and the danger Amir had been in flooded her mind. This was no ordinary disappearance. The life she thought was perfect was unraveling piece by piece, and the worst part was she had no idea how deep it went. Lila sat in the dimly lit bar office, the file still clutched tightly in her hands. Her pulse was pounding in her ears, the words the man had spoken echoing over and over in her mind. "It's over." She felt the weight of his cold dismissal, the finality of it. Amir wasn't coming back. Whatever had happened to him, it wasn't just an accident. This was deliberate. For a long moment, Lila didn't move, her body frozen in place. She couldn't make sense of any of it. Why had Amir disappeared without a word, without a trace? She had thought she knew him better than anyone. But now, she was questioning everything. Her entire life, everything she had believed in was slipping through her fingers. The file on the desk stared at her, its contents still hidden. She had to look. There was no other choice. The uncertainty, the fear were too much. She needed to know. She had to know what had happened to Amir. With trembling hands, she opened the file. Inside was a stack of papers, documents, photos, and a few handwritten notes, all organized in a way that suggested someone had gone through great lengths to keep things secret. Lila pulled out the first photo, a black and white image of Amir standing beside a man she didn't recognize. The man looked older, dressed in a suit with a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. The setting was unfamiliar too, an industrial-looking building in the background, something out of place in Amir's usual world of wealth and luxury. Lila's breath caught in her throat. The man in the photo was holding a briefcase, but what struck her was the way Amir was standing. His posture was tense, almost guarded. There was a look in his eyes, something hard and distant. It didn't match the image of the man she thought she knew. This was not the Amir who smiled at her over dinner or reassured her during their late-night conversations. This was a different man entirely. She moved to the next paper, a series of financial documents. Words like offshore accounts, suspicious transfers, and unreported assets jumped off the page. Lila's heart began to race. This was a web of lies, a network of financial dealings far beyond her understanding. Amir had been involved in something dangerous, something illegal. Her mind raced as she flipped through the pages. More photos, this time of Amir with various figures, some smiling, others more serious, their faces blurred or hidden. But one face was unmistakable. A man in a dark suit sitting at a table, looking directly into the camera with a calculating gaze. Lila felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She knew that face. It was the same man from the photo, the one standing next to Amir. She didn't have a name, but she knew she had to find him. The next document was a letter, typed but unsigned. It was short and cryptic. "You've gone too far, Amir. We've warned you before. The consequences are now unavoidable." Lila's breath hitched. Who had written this? Who was warning Amir? What did it mean? The implications were clear. Whatever Amir had gotten himself into, it was serious, and someone wanted him silenced. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Lila snapped the file shut and stood up quickly, heart pounding. She hadn't heard anyone approach, but now she could hear the faint sound of someone outside the door. Her first instinct was to leave, to run, but she couldn't. Not yet. She needed answers. The door creaked open and Malcolm stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He looked at her, his eyes darting to the closed file in her hands before settling back on her face. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with something darker. Lila didn't know how to answer. She was still processing everything she had found, and the fear of being discovered was overwhelming. I'm trying to understand what's happened," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm trying to find Amir." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. He took a step forward, glancing at the closed file. "Lila," he said quietly, "you need to stop this." Her heart skipped a beat. "Stop? Why?" "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Malcolm said, his tone shifting, becoming more urgent. "This isn't just about Amir. This is bigger than both of us." Lila shook her head, the disbelief on her face clear. "What are you talking about? What's going on? Where is Amir?" Malcolm took a deep breath, and for the first time, Lila saw the vulnerability in his eyes. "Amir's in trouble, deep trouble, and if you keep pushing, you're going to be in it too." Lila took a step back, her mind racing. "I don't care," she whispered. "I need to know. I need to understand why he's gone, why he left me like this." Malcolm looked down at the floor, his jaw tightening. He hesitated for a long moment before finally meeting her gaze again. "You're right. You deserve to know. But I can't help you unless you promise me one thing." "What?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me you'll be careful. There are people out there who won't hesitate to hurt you, just like they hurt Amir." Lila's breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words settled over her, and for the first time she realized how deep this really went. She was in over her head. But there was no turning back now. She nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm not afraid anymore. I'm going to find him, Malcolm. No matter what it takes." Malcolm looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "Then let's get to work." Lila sat at the small desk in the study, the papers scattered around her like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. The file from the bar still lay open in front of her, but she hadn't made much progress. The more she uncovered, the deeper the rabbit hole seemed to go. Every document led to another question, another name, and the more she dug, the more she realized how little she truly knew about Amir. She had always thought she knew him, his mannerisms, his smile, the way he held her close when they went to bed. But now, each page she turned, each new piece of evidence felt like a betrayal. It was as though the man she had married didn't exist, and in his place was someone else, someone she didn't understand. Her fingers hovered over a piece of paper that she had been avoiding. It was a letter, a typed one, addressed to Amir from an unknown source. The words were short, but the weight they carried was immense. "You've crossed a line, Amir. This is your last warning. There is no way out now." Lila felt the familiar chill creep up her spine. Amir had always been careful. He had always known how to protect himself, how to control the narrative. But this letter, these words, it told her something she hadn't wanted to admit. Amir had gotten in too deep. There was no way out for him, and now there might not be any way out for her either. Her phone buzzed, breaking her focus. She didn't recognize the number, but the message made her heart stop. "If you want to understand what happened to Amir, you need to go to the old warehouse on 12th. Tonight." Her hands shook as she read the message over and over. The unknown sender, the same person who had contacted her before, was offering her more answers. But Lila knew deep down that these answers would come with a price. She didn't have time to think about it. She grabbed her coat, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the fragments of her life that had been shattered over the past few days. Who was this person? What did they know about Amir's past? What would they reveal? The night air was crisp as she made her way to the warehouse. She tried to steady her breath, but each step she took felt like it was pulling her deeper into something she wasn't sure she could handle. The warehouse was located on the outskirts of town, far from the mansion she had once called home, hidden away behind layers of secrecy. When she arrived, the place was silent, dark. The door was slightly ajar, an invitation or perhaps a warning. She stepped inside, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. The inside of the warehouse was cold and empty, the only sound her footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. She called out softly, but her voice was swallowed by the vast empty space. No response. Then out of the corner of her eye she saw it, an old photograph pinned to the wall. It was faded, the edges curling with age, but there was no mistaking it. Amir was in the photo, standing next to a man she didn't recognize. The setting was unclear, but it looked like some sort of underground operation. Stacks of money, barrels that didn't belong in a place like this. As she moved closer, she felt a cold shiver run through her. This was no ordinary picture. The look on Amir's face was different from any she had seen before. Hard, calculating, almost like a stranger. This wasn't the man she had married. This was someone else entirely. Lila's fingers trembled as she reached for the photograph. She pulled it off the wall, trying to steady her breathing. But as she examined it closer, she noticed something else. The name written in the corner was a name she had never heard before, Dmitry Volkov. Her breath caught in her throat. The name felt like a key unlocking something she wasn't prepared to face. She had heard whispers of Volkov's name before, the rumors about an international criminal network, a web of money laundering and shady deals that stretched across borders, involved people who were untouchable. But Amir had never mentioned this name to her. Why had he kept this from her? The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. She froze, her pulse racing. She didn't know who was coming, but she had a sinking feeling that this was no coincidence. Someone knew she was here. Before she could move, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man, tall, his features hidden beneath the brim of a hat, his hands tucked in his jacket. "Looking for answers?" he asked, his voice cold, unfeeling. Lila's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you know about Amir?" The man stepped closer, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Amir got involved with things he shouldn't have," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "And now he's paying the price, just like the rest of us." "Where is he?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the photograph in her hand. "You've already seen too much," he said, his voice low and threatening. "And you've made a mistake coming here. You're in danger now, just like him." Lila's mind spun as she tried to process what he was saying. Who was this man? What was he involved in? And why had Amir kept all of this from her? The man took another step forward, his face hardening. "You'll find the truth, but you won't like what you uncover. No one who gets involved with Dmitry Volkov walks away unscathed." The words hit her like a punch. Volkov. This man was tied to the same criminal network Amir had been involved with, the same network that had led to Amir's disappearance. She was tangled in something far darker than she had imagined. "I'm getting out of here," Lila said, her voice shaking. She backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the man's face. She had to get out, had to make sense of what she had just learned. "You can leave," the man said, his voice soft. "But the truth will catch up with you. It always does." Lila turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the empty warehouse. She had no idea what she was walking into, but one thing was clear now. There was no turning back. Lila's heart was racing as she stepped out of the dark warehouse, the cold air biting at her skin. The encounter with the man had left her shaken, her mind swirling with questions that had no answers. Volkov, Dmitry Volkov. She couldn't stop thinking about the name. She had heard whispers, rumors of a criminal network that spanned continents, but she had never imagined Amir was involved in something so dangerous. She needed to talk to Malcolm. He was the only one who could shed light on this, on everything. As she made her way back to the car, her hands trembling, the weight of what she had just learned threatened to overwhelm her. The truth was darker than she had imagined, and the more she uncovered, the more she felt like she was losing control. She dialed Malcolm's number, her finger pressing down on the screen with urgency. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Lila?" His voice sounded strained, like he had been waiting for her call. "Where are you? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said, trying to steady her breath. "No, I'm not. Malcolm, I need to talk to you. It's about Amir. It's about everything." She heard him sigh on the other end. Lila, we've talked about this. You're not safe. I don't care about that right now. There's something you're not telling me. I went to the warehouse. I met someone there, someone who knew about Amir, and he said Amir was involved with Volkov. The words tumbled out in a rush like a flood of emotion finally breaking free. There was a long pause, and then Malcolm's voice came back quiet and tense. You shouldn't have gone there. You don't understand what you're dealing with. This isn't something you can just walk away from, Lila. I don't care what I can or can't walk away from, Lila snapped, her voice trembling. You knew, didn't you? You knew what was going on with Amir, didn't you? You knew he was in danger, and you kept it from me. Malcolm didn't respond right away, but Lila could hear the hesitation in his breath. He was avoiding something, avoiding the truth. Malcolm, Lila whispered, her voice breaking. I need you to tell me the truth. What is going on? What has Amir gotten himself into? He exhaled sharply. You don't want to know, Lila. I never wanted you to get caught up in this. Lila's chest tightened. You're lying to me again. Why couldn't you just tell me? Why couldn't you warn me? You're supposed to be my friend. There was a long silence, and then Malcolm finally spoke, his voice barely audible. I never wanted this for you. I thought if I kept you out of it, you'd be safe. But you don't understand. This isn't something you can fix. There's too much at stake. Too much at stake, Lila repeated, her voice rising. My husband is missing. He's gone, Malcolm, and you're telling me I can't fix this? I'm telling you to stay away, Lila, Malcolm snapped, his patience clearly wearing thin. You don't know who you're dealing with. Volkov isn't just some small-time criminal. He's dangerous. And Amir's involvement with him, it goes deeper than you can imagine. Lila's heart dropped. What do you mean deeper? What are you not telling me? Malcolm's voice softened, but there was no comfort in it. You don't know the full story. Amir, he didn't just get involved with Volkov for money. There was a reason, a personal reason. And that reason, he stopped himself, his words hanging in the air like a curse. I never wanted you to find out, Lila, but now you're already too far in. It's too late. Lila's breath hitched, a cold shiver running through her. What are you saying? What happened? What is the truth? Malcolm let out a long sigh, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. I didn't want you to know this, but if you're really asking, then here it is. Amir was trying to escape. He was trying to get out, but Volkov wouldn't let him. He wasn't just working for him, he was being used. And when he tried to leave, when he tried to cut ties, that's when everything went wrong. They took him, Lila. Lila's head spun. They took him? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. What do you mean they took him? Why didn't you tell me? I couldn't, Malcolm said, his voice thick with guilt. I couldn't because I was part of it. I was the one who helped Amir get involved with Volkov in the first place. I thought it was the only way to protect him. But when he wanted out, I couldn't help him anymore. They don't let people leave, Lila. Once you're in for life. Lila felt the ground beneath her feet shift. Betrayal. It hit her like a tidal wave. The man she had trusted, the one person who had been by her side through everything. He had known, and he hadn't said a word. She had been blind, so focused on Amir's disappearance that she hadn't even noticed the cracks in her own life. You? She whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. You knew all along. Malcolm's voice cracked. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted this to happen. But Amir, he was already in too deep. And now he's gone. Lila stood there, the phone pressed to her ear, her body trembling with rage and heartbreak. Every ounce of trust she had placed in Malcolm was shattered, and in its place, all that was left was a bitter, aching emptiness. The man she had trusted had been lying to her. The man who had promised to protect her had been keeping secrets that could have saved Amir but instead had condemned him. I need to go, she said, her voice barely audible, the words like poison on her lips. I can't do this anymore. I trusted you, Malcolm. The line went silent. But Lila didn't need to hear anything else. She had heard all she needed to. She hung up the phone, the sound of the click ringing in her ears, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt completely, utterly alone. Lila sat in the car, the engine running, the city lights casting long shadows across the dashboard. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached. The weight of the conversation with Malcolm still hung heavy in her mind. How could she have been so blind? The betrayal she felt was suffocating, and yet there was no time to mourn it. Amir was out there, and she had to find him before it was too late. But she knew one thing for sure. The man she had trusted, the man who had been by her side through everything, had been hiding something far darker than she could have ever imagined. And now, she had no choice but to dig deeper into the shadows, no matter how dangerous it was. Her phone buzzed again, the familiar sound jolting her from her thoughts. A new message. "Meet me at the old pier. I can help you find Amir, but only if you trust me." It was from a number she didn't recognize. The message was cryptic, vague, but something about it felt different from the others she had received. There was an urgency in the words, a promise that maybe, just maybe, this person could help her. She didn't think twice. Lila turned the car around and headed for the pier. As she drove, the thoughts racing through her mind only grew louder. What had Amir gotten himself into? What had Malcolm meant by too deep? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this whole mess. Things she wasn't being told, things that could unravel everything she thought she knew about her life, her marriage, and her place in Amir's world. The pier was empty when she arrived. The wind howled, tugging at her coat as she stepped out of the car. The salty air cut through her, but the cold wasn't the only thing making her shiver. There was something about this place, this abandoned spot on the outskirts of town, that felt wrong, like she was being drawn into something she wasn't prepared for. Lila took a deep breath and walked toward the edge, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Her footsteps echoed in the night, breaking the silence around her. The pier stretched out over the dark water, the creaking of the old wood under her feet sending a chill through her bones. Then she saw him, a figure standing near the end of the pier, barely visible in the dark. The man's silhouette was tall and imposing, but there was something oddly familiar about him. He was waiting for her, just standing there, his hands in his pockets. Lila's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice steady despite the rising tension in her chest. "What do you know about Amir?" The man turned slowly, and Lila's breath caught in her throat. It was someone she hadn't expected, a face she had seen before, but never in this context. It was Tariq, Amir's old business partner. "I thought you knew better than to come here, Lila," Tariq said, his voice low and cold. "But here you are, asking questions, dangerous questions." Lila felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. "You know where Amir is, don't you?" she asked, stepping closer, her eyes narrowing. "Tell me what's going on. Why did he disappear? Why didn't you warn me?" Tariq's eyes flickered in the dim light, a small smirk forming on his lips. "Warn you? You think I was going to protect you from the truth?" He stepped forward, his gaze intense. "There are things you don't understand, Lila. Things you can't even begin to comprehend." "What do you mean?" she pressed, her voice rising. "Tell me. I deserve to know the truth. Amir, he's missing. And you're involved in this. You owe me an explanation." Tariq looked at her with something that almost resembled pity. "I'm not the one you should be asking," he said, his voice taking on a darker tone. "The ones you should fear aren't me. They're the ones who control everything. The ones who made sure Amir couldn't escape." Lila felt her stomach drop. Who? Who are you talking about?" Tariq's gaze flickered again, but this time there was something in his eyes, a fleeting glance of fear. "Volkov," he whispered, his voice barely audible against the wind. "Dmitry Volkov is not just some petty criminal. He runs everything. Everything your husband got involved in, it's all connected to him. And when Amir tried to leave, they made him pay." Lila's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean, he tried to leave?" She couldn't wrap her head around it. Amir had never told her any of this. He had kept everything hidden. All this time she had been so blind. Tariq stepped closer, his face hardening. "Amir was trapped, Lila. There's no escaping Volkov's reach. The moment he stepped into that world, there was no turning back. And now you're part of it too. You want to find him? You have to understand, if you keep digging, you'll end up just like him. Like him. Lila repeated, her voice cracking. What does that mean? Where is he? What's happened to Amir? Tariq's eyes softened for a brief moment, but his next words were a harsh reminder of the gravity of the situation. Amir is gone, and if you're not careful, you'll be next. They don't leave loose ends. You've already seen too much. Lila stepped back, trying to process the overwhelming truth. You're saying he's dead? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Tariq didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on hers, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, he spoke. I don't know where he is, but I know this much. If you keep asking, you'll make yourself a target. And the truth? It's more dangerous than you think. With that, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Lila standing alone on the pier, the weight of his words sinking in like a stone in her chest. Her mind raced. Volkov. Dead or alive, Amir had been tangled in a web that she didn't even fully understand. But one thing was clear now. There was no turning back. She had to find the truth. But at what cost? Lila sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The wind whipped at the windows, but inside there was only a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. Every word that Tariq had said, every revelation he had dropped, echoed in her mind like a mantra she couldn't shake. Dmitry Volkov. That name, the shadow it cast, had been the source of Amir's undoing, and now it seemed to be the key to everything. The truth was unraveling around her, each layer more suffocating than the last. Amir's past, his ties to Volkov, had been hidden from her, and now she was left to pick up the pieces of a life she thought she knew. Lila's phone buzzed in her lap, the sound jolting her out of her thoughts. She glanced down, seeing an unknown number. With a hesitant breath, she answered. Lila? The voice on the other end was gruff, familiar but strained. It's Malcolm. Her chest tightened. She didn't want to talk to him, not now. But she couldn't ignore him either. What do you want? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I know what you're thinking, Malcolm said, his voice low, but you need to stop. You're going too far. You don't know what you're dealing with. Lila's grip on the phone tightened. You're the one who's been hiding the truth from me, Malcolm. How long were you planning on keeping this from me? How long were you going to pretend like nothing was wrong? Malcolm was silent for a long moment before responding. Lila, you don't understand. If you keep going down this path, you'll destroy everything. You'll destroy yourself. Lila's heart raced. What do you mean, destroy myself? You're in too deep, he continued, his tone desperate. This isn't just about Amir anymore. Volkov won't stop, and the people he's involved with, you have no idea what they're capable of. Lila felt the ground beneath her shift. I don't care what they're capable of. Amir is my husband. I need to know the truth. You don't, Malcolm snapped. You don't need to know. Trust me, Lila. You're better off staying out of this. His words were like daggers, each one a painful reminder of the lies, the secrets, and the betrayal that had been festering between them. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't. Where is he, Malcolm? She asked, her voice cracking, her anger rising. Where is Amir? You don't want to know, Malcolm said quietly. I've already told you too much. If you keep asking, it's only going to make things worse. Tell me, Lila shouted, her voice sharp and desperate. Tell me where he is. What happened to him? There was another long silence, but this time when Malcolm spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. He's gone. He's not coming back. The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of her. Gone? What do you mean gone? How do you know that? Malcolm didn't answer. Lila's head spun as his words sank in, but her thoughts were interrupted by another voice, this one cold and unfamiliar, coming through the phone. Because I made sure of it. Lila froze. Her body went stiff. Who is this? She demanded, her heart thudding in her chest. A laugh, cold and low, echoed through the line. Someone who knows your husband better than you do, Lila. Her heart skipped. What do you want? What did you do to Amir? You don't get to ask the questions anymore, the voice said, its tone full of malice. If you keep pushing, you'll find out. But I'll warn you now, there's no coming back from it. The line went dead. Lila sat there, numb. Her hands were shaking, the phone now clutched tightly in her lap, but she couldn't seem to make herself move. Whoever that was, they knew more than she did. They knew what had happened to Amir, and now she was more certain than ever. This was bigger than she had imagined. The legacy of lies, betrayal, and violence that had been hidden from her for so long was now staring her in the face. She had uncovered pieces of the puzzle, but the final picture was still out of reach. Amir was caught in something far darker than she could have ever imagined, and now she was trapped in it too. Lila's fingers hovered over her phone as she tried to decide what to do next. She had to find the truth. She had to find Amir, dead or alive, but she had no idea where to start. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text message from an unfamiliar number. "Come to the docks. If you want to find out what happened, you have to meet me there. Don't bring anyone." Lila's breath hitched. The docks. It was a place she knew well, but she had never imagined she'd end up there like this, alone, desperate and afraid. But there was no turning back. She had to go. She had to know the truth, no matter the cost. Lila started the car, her hands still trembling as she pulled away from the curb. The night felt heavier now, the weight of the decision she was making pressing down on her. She couldn't stop now. Whatever happened next, she had to face it. She had to find the answers. The docks were eerily silent when Lila arrived. The sound of the waves slapping gently against the wooden pylons, the only thing breaking the thick silence. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the water. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of salt and decay. Lila's heart hammered in her chest as she pulled the car to a stop near the edge of the pier. She had no idea who had texted her, but everything inside her screamed that this was a mistake. Still, there was no turning back now. She grabbed her bag and stepped out of the car, the cold wind biting at her skin. Her mind raced with all the unanswered questions, the same ones that had haunted her for days. What had Amir gotten himself into? Why had he hidden so much from her? And why was she being dragged into all of this now? The message had been clear. Come alone. You'll get the answers you're looking for. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pull her here, to this desolate place where the danger felt tangible, like a predator waiting to strike. Lila checked her phone once more, the screen illuminated by the dim light from the car. No new messages. The docks were empty, save for the rusted remnants of old shipping containers and the faint outline of a boat moored further down the pier. She could barely make out the silhouette of a man standing near the boat, waiting for her. His posture was rigid, commanding, but his face was hidden by the shadows. She hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling her to turn around, but she couldn't. She needed to know. She needed the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. With hesitant steps, she approached the man. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness of the night, the sound magnified by the emptiness around her. The closer she got, the more her stomach churned, the air growing thicker with every step. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had walked straight into a trap. When she was only a few feet away, the man finally spoke. "You came alone. Good," he said, his voice low and rough, but there was something in it that made Lila's blood run cold. He didn't move, just stood there, watching her closely. "You want answers, don't you?" Lila didn't answer at first, her mind still racing with thoughts of who this man could be and what kind of game he was playing. She nodded slowly, trying to remain composed. "Where is Amir?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear twisting inside her. "What have you done to him?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back, gesturing for her to follow him. He led her towards the boat, which bobbed gently in the water, its hull creaking as though it was alive, waiting. The darkness seemed to close in around them, the shadows stretching farther with each step. "Where is he?" Lila demanded again, her voice rising. The anxiety in her chest was becoming unbearable, each second of silence feeling like an eternity. "I don't have time for games. What have you done to Amir?" The man finally turned to face her, a smirk pulling at the corners of his lips. "You're too eager, Lila. But that's what I like about you, always rushing into things without thinking." He stepped aside, revealing something in the boat, a large duffel bag. Lila's eyes went wide with recognition. The bag looked familiar. Too familiar. Her breath caught in her throat as she took another step forward, her instinct screaming at her to stop. "I told you," the the man said softly, his voice dark with amusement. You want the truth, don't you? Well, here it is. He reached into the duffel bag and pulled out a bundle of clothes, nothing but scraps of fabric at first glance. But as he spread them out, Lila's heart stopped. It was Amir's jacket, the very jacket he had worn countless times. The fabric was torn, stained, and covered in dirt, as though it had been dragged across the ground. There was no sign of Amir himself, no sign that he was still alive. Lila's breath hitched. Her legs felt weak, her knees threatening to give out beneath her. The jacket. Was this some twisted message? Was this all that was left of Amir? Her eyes burned with the tears she refused to let fall, her chest tight as she fought to hold herself together. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, this isn't happening. Where is he? She demanded again, her voice trembling, barely audible. The man's expression darkened, his smile gone. He took a step toward her, his voice cold. You want to know the truth? Amir tried to escape. He couldn't, and now he's paying the price. Lila's world seemed to tilt on its axis. The words hung in the air like a weight, pulling her down with them. Escape? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. He tried to leave? Why didn't he tell me? The man just shrugged as if it didn't matter. Amir was always a coward. He thought he could outrun Volkov, but no one outruns Volkov. No one. And now the price for his betrayal is being paid. Lila's mind reeled. Betrayal, Amir, Volkov. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, each piece of the puzzle clicking into place. But the picture it formed was one she didn't want to see. But I loved him, Lila said, the words heavy with heartbreak. I loved him and I didn't know. I didn't know any of this. I didn't know what he was involved in. The man stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Well, now you know. But it's too late for you to change anything. You're already in the game, Lila. The question is, how long do you think you can survive? Lila's pulse raced. What are you talking about? The man's lips twisted into a grin. You want to find Amir? Keep digging, and you'll find out. But don't say I didn't warn you. Before she could say anything more, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Lila standing alone by the boat, her mind spinning. Her hands trembled as she turned to leave, the weight of the man's words sinking in. Too late. How much deeper did this go? And what kind of price was she about to pay for the truth? Lila's legs felt like they were made of lead as she walked back to her car. The weight of what the man had said, the implications of Amir's betrayal, his involvement with Volkov, and now the chilling reminder that she was in too deep, pressed down on her chest like an anvil. The night air, though cold, felt suffocating, each breath harder than the last as she struggled to process everything. She couldn't afford to let herself fall apart now. She couldn't give up, no matter how much it hurt. Amir was out there, somewhere, and she was going to find him, no matter the cost. Lila sat in the car, staring at the dashboard, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. What did it all mean? How could she not have seen the signs? How could she have missed what was right in front of her? The phone in her hand vibrated again, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. The familiar sound of a message. She didn't recognize the number, but the words on the screen made her stomach drop. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th. If you want the truth about Amir, it's time to stop running. Come alone. Lila's pulse quickened. The warehouse. It felt like she was being pulled back into a game she had no control over, a game that was far more dangerous than she ever realized. The man at the docks had warned her, and yet, here she was, still chasing after the same elusive answers, still putting herself in harm's way. But she didn't hesitate. She had no choice but to go. She had to face this, even if it meant confronting the terrifying truth that she didn't want to hear. The drive felt like a blur. The city streets passed by without Lila even registering them, her mind consumed with the gravity of what she was about to uncover. She didn't know what awaited her at the warehouse, but something told her that this was it, the moment she'd been dreading and hoping for all at once, the truth. When she arrived, the warehouse was as desolate as ever, a hulking structure that loomed over the quiet street. It was the kind of place that had witnessed countless secrets, and Lila had the distinct feeling that she was about to uncover the darkest one yet. She parked the car, her hands shaking as she reached for the door handle. The night was quiet. but the silence felt ominous, as though something was watching her every move. She tried to steady her breath, but the closer she got to the entrance, the more the dread settled in her chest. The door creaked open as she pushed it, the sound of the rusty hinges cutting through the stillness. Inside, the warehouse was dark, lit only by the faint light coming through the broken windows. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy, as if the place hadn't been touched in years. Lila stepped inside, the cold concrete beneath her feet echoing her every step. She called out softly, but the silence swallowed her voice. She was alone, or so it seemed. Then she saw him, the figure standing in the shadows, his features obscured by the darkness. He stepped forward, and even before he spoke, Lila recognized him. It was Malcolm. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she was paralyzed. She had expected so many things tonight, but never this, not him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a mix of shock and anger. Malcolm's face was unreadable, his expression cold as he stepped closer to her. "You wanted the truth, Lila," he said, his voice low and heavy with regret. "And now you have it." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about? What truth?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're too close to the edge now. I tried to protect you, but I can't anymore." Lila took a step back, her chest tight with panic. "What does that mean, Malcolm? What did you do? Where is Amir?" He exhaled sharply, as if the weight of what he was about to say was too much for him to bear. "I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted you to be involved in any of this, Lila. But Amir, he got in too deep, and he couldn't get out." Lila's mind spun. "Get out of what? What are you talking about?" Malcolm's gaze dropped, and for the first time, he looked like he was truly struggling with something. Amir was involved with Volkov's network, but it wasn't just about the money. It was personal. Volkov didn't just use him, he manipulated him. And when Amir tried to cut ties, they didn't let him. They couldn't afford to lose someone like him. Lila's heart sank. "You knew all of this and you never told me? You let me marry him, let me live this lie while you knew exactly what he was involved in?" Her voice was shaking with a mix of anger and hurt, the betrayal cutting deeper than anything she had ever felt. Malcolm looked at her, his face etched with guilt. "I didn't want you to know, Lila. I thought I could protect you, but now I see how wrong I was." Lila's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle finally starting to click into place. "Where is he, Malcolm?" she demanded again. "What happened to him?" Malcolm's gaze softened, but there was no comfort in it. "He's gone, Lila. You don't want to know what they did to him. Volkov's people, they don't just disappear. They're too powerful." Lila felt the ground fall out beneath her. "What do you mean? He's dead?" "I'm sorry," Malcolm whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Lila felt her knees give out, and she sank to the cold concrete floor, her world collapsing around her. The man she loved, the man she had trusted with her life, was gone. And now, she was left to pick up the pieces of a life she didn't even recognize. The truth was more than she could bear. Lila's mind was a whirlwind of confusion, panic, and disbelief as she stumbled out of the warehouse, the weight of Malcolm's words still pressing down on her chest. She had wanted answers, but the truth had shattered her more than she could have imagined. Amir was gone, dead, and it was all tied to a web of lies, betrayal, and a powerful criminal empire that she had never even known existed. She tried to steady herself, to breathe, but the air felt suffocating. She didn't know where to go, who to trust, or how to even begin making sense of it all. The man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, was gone. And now she was left alone, without a clear path forward. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her back to reality. She pulled it out, her hands trembling as she saw a new message. It was from an unknown number. "If you want to survive, you need to leave now. They're coming for you. Don't wait. Don't tell anyone." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the message, the words sending a wave of fear through her. Who was this? Who knew she was in danger? She didn't hesitate. There was no time to waste. She had to get out now. The truth had become a deadly game, and she was no longer just a spectator. She was part of it, caught in a web of violence and manipulation that had its claws in everything she knew. She looked around, her mind racing. She couldn't go back to the mansion. It was too dangerous. She couldn't trust anyone, not even Malcolm anymore. The one person she thought she could rely on had just shattered her world. He had lied to her, kept secrets that had put her life in jeopardy. With no time to waste, Lila made the decision. She needed to disappear. She needed to get away before they found her, before the people who had killed Amir turned their attention to her. Her car was still parked in the same spot, the headlights casting long shadows over the empty street. She climbed in quickly, starting the engine, her hands shaking as she pulled away from the warehouse. The streets felt like a maze, each turn pulling her farther from the life she knew, farther from the people she trusted. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out where to go. She had no plan, no clear direction, but somewhere deep inside, she knew she had to keep moving. The message had been clear. They were coming for her, and if she stayed in one place for too long, they would find her. As she drove, her thoughts went back to Amir. He had been trapped, manipulated into a life he couldn't escape. He had been trying to break free, trying to get out of the clutches of Volkov's empire, and now he was gone. Lila slammed her fist against the steering wheel, her frustration boiling over. How had it come to this? How had she not seen the signs? She had trusted Malcolm, trusted Amir, and all along they had been hiding the truth from her. She had been so naive, so blind. A sharp turn brought her onto a desolate road, one she recognized only vaguely. She hadn't meant to come here, but it was too late to turn back. The road stretched out ahead of her, the headlights illuminating the dark path. She didn't know where this road would lead, but it was the only choice she had left. As she drove deeper into the night, her mind wandered back to the message. They're coming for you. Who was the sender? Was it someone from Volkov's network? Was it someone trying to help her, or was it another trap? She couldn't trust anyone anymore, not even her own instincts. The sound of her phone ringing shattered her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, seeing Malcolm's name flash across it. Her heart lurched, but she didn't pick up. She couldn't. She didn't trust him anymore. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a voicemail. Lila didn't bother to listen. She couldn't handle hearing his voice right now. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. She had given him everything, trusted him with her life, and he had lied to her. She had to keep moving, keep running. The road began to twist and turn, the dark trees surrounding her on either side. She was deep in unfamiliar territory now, and she felt the unease creeping up her spine. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she couldn't stay still, not when her life was at stake. She spotted a small, dimly lit gas station in the distance, the flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow. She pulled over, parking beside the pumps. The place looked deserted, but Lila didn't take any chances. She locked the doors and sat in silence for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. She had no money, no plan, and no one to turn to. But there was one person she could trust. One person who had been in the shadows all along. Her mind flashed to the mysterious figure who had texted her earlier, the one who had warned her. Was it someone who had been watching her? Someone who had been keeping track of her movements? The possibility sent a shiver down her spine, but she couldn't afford to waste time second-guessing. She had to find out who was behind the message, who was offering her a chance to escape. With a deep breath, Lila grabbed her phone and dialed the number. The call rang for what felt like an eternity before it was answered. She could barely hear the voice on the other end, but the words were clear. "Are you ready to get out, Lila?" The voice was calm, calculating. She couldn't place it, but something about it felt familiar. "Yes," she replied, her voice shaking with uncertainty. "But how do I know I can trust you?" "You don't," the voice said. "But if you want to live, you don't have much choice." Lila closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The escape she had been desperately searching for was within her reach, but at what cost? Lila's heart was pounding in her chest as she walked down the narrow alley toward the warehouse. She had no idea what to expect, but something in her gut told her that this would be the moment she had been dreading. The truth had already shattered her once, but now it felt like the final pieces of her world were about to fall into place, and she wasn't sure if she could survive it. The last few days had been a blur of fear, confusion, and desperation. She had escaped, hidden, and followed the breadcrumbs that led her here. To this place, the final destination where everything would be revealed. As she stepped into the dimly lit warehouse, her eyes immediately found the figure standing in the center of the room. The figure who had been pulling the strings behind it all. The figure who knew more than anyone else about what had really happened to Amir. It was Dmitry Volkov. He stood tall, his presence commanding, as if the darkness of the warehouse itself had bent to his will. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto Lila's as she entered, his lips curling into a smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Lila," he said smoothly, his voice low and unhurried, "you made it. I didn't expect you to, but here we are." Lila didn't move, her hands trembling at her sides. She didn't know how she had gotten here, but she had no choice now but to face him. To confront the man who had been behind everything, the man who had destroyed her life, who had destroyed Amir. "Where is he?" Lila's voice was steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "What did you do to him?" Volkov's smile didn't falter. "Amir. Ah, yes, the loyal soldier who thought he could escape." He took a slow step toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. "He tried to leave, Lila. He didn't understand that once you're in my world, there's no way out. Not alive anyway." Lila's chest tightened. "You killed him," she whispered, though she already knew the truth. It was written in his eyes, in his words. Volkov's smile only grew wider. "Not exactly, but the choice was his. He could have stayed and played his part, but he chose to betray me. And when you betray someone like me, the price is high." Lila took a step forward, her fists clenched at her sides. "He was trying to protect me," she said, her voice shaking with the raw emotion that was threatening to overtake her. "He was trying to get out of your world." Volkov's eyes flickered with something. Was it amusement? "Protect you?" He chuckled softly. "Lila, you've always been so naive. Amir never protected you. He used you, just like everyone else. He wasn't trying to protect you. He was trying to protect himself." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. "That's a lie," she whispered. But even as she said it, a seed of doubt began to grow inside her. Could it really have been true? Could Amir have been using her all along? Volkov took another step closer, his gaze never leaving her face. "You really don't understand, do you? Everything was part of the game. Amir was just a piece, a pawn I let play for a while. He had his uses, but when he outlived his usefulness..." He shrugged as if discarding an old coat. "Well, you saw what happened." Lila's breath caught in her throat, the pain in her chest nearly unbearable. "You're lying," she managed, but the sting of his words had left a mark. Amir, her husband, had been caught in a world he could never escape. Had he really been playing her too? "You still don't get it," Volkov said, his voice smooth, almost sympathetic. "None of this was personal, Lila. It was business. And Amir was just part of that business. Now you're in it too. You're tangled in a web, and you'll never escape. Not now." Lila's heart was racing, her vision swimming with everything she had learned. The lies, the deceit, the betrayal. And yet there was one thing that still lingered in her mind. One question she had to ask, no matter the consequences. "Why didn't you just kill me too?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Volkov paused for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he shrugged. "Because, Lila, you have something I need. Something more valuable than you can imagine. You see, you're the key, the final piece of the puzzle." Lila's chest tightened, her pulse quickening. "What are you talking about? What do you want from me?" He smiled. "I want you to keep playing the game, the same way Amir did. But now it's your turn. You can't run. You can't hide. You're in too deep, and it's too late for you to turn back." The truth hit her like a wave. All of it, the lies, the manipulation, the cruelty, had been leading to this. Volkov had been playing a game all along, and she had been a pawn in it, just like Amir. But no more. Lila stood taller, her gaze never wavering. "I'm done playing your game," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You think you can control me? You think you can break me? Well, I'm not afraid of you anymore." Volkov's smile faltered for a split second, and in that moment, Lila realized something. He was afraid. He was afraid of losing control. Without warning, she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cold concrete. Behind her, she heard Volkov's voice calling out, but it was too late. She was already moving, already escaping the trap he had set for her. Lila didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. She would fight, she would survive, and she would make sure that Volkov would never have control over her or anyone else again. Lila's legs felt weak as she staggered away from the warehouse, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins, but her mind clouded with the aftermath of what had just happened. She had escaped, but the weight of everything, the lies, the betrayal, and the truth about Amir, had left an indelible mark on her soul. The world outside felt different, as if the veil that had once shielded her from the reality of her life had finally been ripped away. Her life had been a lie, a facade built on secrets and half-truths. Amir was gone, and Volkov, the man who had orchestrated everything, was still out there, untouchable. But for the first time in a long while, Lila realized she had the power to reclaim what had been taken from her. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone, dialing a number she hadn't called in weeks. It rang 3 times before the voice on the other end answered, filled with urgency. "Lila?" Malcolm's voice cracked. "Where are you? Are you okay?" She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her. "I'm fine," she said, though it felt like a lie. "I need to see you." There was a brief pause before Malcolm responded, his voice laced with caution. "Lila, I don't know if that's a good idea." "I don't care," she snapped, her voice hardening. "I need to hear you say it. I need you to tell me the truth. I need closure." Malcolm was silent for a long moment. "Okay," he finally said. "Where?" The meeting place was a quiet cafe in a part of town that still felt untouched by the chaos she had just experienced. Lila arrived first, sitting at a corner table, her fingers tapping anxiously against the cup of coffee in front of her. The minutes ticked by slowly, the weight of the decision settling heavily on her. She wasn't sure what she wanted to hear from Malcolm. What could he possibly say to fix this, to fix what he had done? But she needed to hear it from him before she could truly move on. When Malcolm walked in, his eyes immediately found hers. He looked older, worn down by the burden of his own guilt. He sat down without a word, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes avoiding hers. "I'm sorry, Lila," he said finally, his voice low. "I should have told you everything. I should have protected you from this mess." "You didn't protect me, Malcolm," Lila replied, her voice steady but her heart aching. "You lied to me. You kept secrets that ended up costing me everything." "I thought I was doing what was best for you," he said, the pain in his voice raw. "I thought if I kept you out of it, you'd be safe. But I see now that I was wrong. Amir, he was trying to escape. He was trying to get out of Volkov's grip, and I just didn't want you to get hurt. I never meant for any of this to happen." Lila's breath caught in her throat as she listened. The words Malcolm was saying didn't make it hurt less. They didn't bring Amir back, but in that moment, she realized something. This wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about taking control of her own future. "You should have told me, Malcolm," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You should have trusted me with the truth. We could have fought this together. I would have stood by you." "I know," he whispered, his voice filled with regret. "I failed you." Lila closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't sure if she could ever forgive him, but in that moment she realized forgiveness wasn't the point. It wasn't about letting him off the hook. It was about letting go, about finding peace. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like ages. "I don't know what's next, Malcolm," she said, her voice softer now, more resolute. "But I do know this. Whatever happened to Amir, whatever you and I were a part of, it doesn't define me. It doesn't define my future." He didn't say anything in response. He didn't need to. The truth was in the silence between them, in the way their eyes met, the understanding passing between them. She didn't need closure in the way she had thought. She had found it for herself. It wasn't in the answers or the apology. It was in the strength she had found within herself to keep going. "I'm leaving town," Lila continued, her voice steady. "I don't know where I'm going yet, but I need to get away from all of this. I need to start over." Malcolm's face softened with sadness. "I understand. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope you find what you're looking for. You deserve peace." Lila nodded, standing up. She had nothing more to say to him. The past was behind her now. It was time to move forward, to reclaim her life. She walked toward the door, the weight of the decision lifting off her shoulders with each step. Outside, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the city. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lila felt a sense of calm settle over her. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time she wasn't afraid. She had faced the truth. She had survived the storm, and now she was ready to begin again. Lila stood at the edge of the pier, looking out at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow across the water. She had been driving for hours, the open road stretching ahead of her like a blank canvas. Every mile that passed, every town she drove through, felt like a step further away from the life she had known. And that was exactly what she needed. She had made the decision to leave everything behind. The mansion, the lies, the web of deceit that had entangled her for so long. And most of all, the darkness of the past that had threatened to swallow her whole. The past few weeks had been a blur, chasing shadows, uncovering truths that had ripped apart everything she had believed. The man she had loved was gone, and with him, the life she had built. But Lila knew now that she couldn't stay trapped in the memories of what had been. She had to move forward. She had to heal. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the quiet moment. She pulled it out, but her finger hovered over the screen for a moment before she decided not to answer. It was probably Malcolm. She'd been avoiding his calls, and maybe, just maybe, this was a sign that she didn't need to keep looking back. She had heard enough. She knew the truth. And now, it was time to let go. Lila turned away from the water, the wind picking up as it swept through her hair. She was leaving the past behind, and with it, the people who had hurt her. She had learned enough about herself through this ordeal to know that she was stronger than she had ever realized. She had survived betrayal, loss, and darkness. She had faced her fears, and now she was walking away with nothing but the future in front of her. Her journey had been a painful one. The road had been full of twists and turns, each one more treacherous than the last. But through it all, Lila had discovered something she had never known before. She was capable of more than she thought. She had the strength to rebuild, to start fresh, to write her own story. Her phone buzzed again, but this time Lila didn't even look at the screen. She tucked the phone back into her bag and took a deep breath, letting the salty air fill her lungs. She had made her decision. She wasn't going to let anyone or anything pull her back into the past. It was time to move on. Lila didn't know exactly where she was going, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't need to. She was free. Free from the past, free from the secrets, free from the suffocating grip of the life she had once known. The road stretched out before her like a promise, an endless stretch of possibilities. She had no idea what the future held, but she wasn't afraid. She had the power to shape her own destiny. She started the engine of the car, the hum of the motor filling the silence. As she drove, the miles seemed to slip away, one after another, until she couldn't remember what it felt like to be trapped. All she could feel now was the freedom of the open road. The weight in her chest had lifted, and as she drove further away from the past, Lila could feel the pieces of her life falling into place. She was moving on. She was moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was living for herself. She didn't need the answers anymore. The truth had been revealed, and with it, the chance to rebuild, to find peace in the midst of the chaos. She was done running from the truth. Now she was embracing it, and it felt like a new beginning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lila smiled to herself. She didn't know where the road would take her, but she was ready for whatever came next. The sun was setting as Lila stood outside the small house she had rented for the past few weeks. The days had blurred together since her escape, and now, standing in front of the place she had called home for a short while, it all felt surreal. The house had been a refuge, a place where she could breathe, think, and begin to piece her life back together. But now, it was time to leave it behind. Her fingers grazed the keys in her hand, the feeling of finality sinking in. It wasn't just the house she was leaving behind. It was everything. The past, the lies, the pain, the betrayal. All of it was becoming a distant memory that she knew would never truly leave her, but she couldn't let it define her anymore. As she stepped into the house for the last time, the familiar creaks of the wooden floor beneath her feet seemed oddly comforting, as if the house itself understood what she was going through. Lila walked through each room slowly, taking in the small details that had made it feel like hers. An old chair by the window, a book she had left on the coffee table, the soft hum of the refrigerator. It all seemed so normal, so ordinary. Yet, she knew that what had happened to her, to Amir, and to the life she had thought she understood, was anything but ordinary. Lila closed her eyes, the memories flooding back, the love, the lies, the pain. She had spent so much of her life trying to hold on to something that wasn't real, but now she had to let go of Amir, let go of the false sense of security that had once made her feel safe, let go of the past and everything that had shaped her. It was time to move forward. She walked out to the small porch, her suitcase in hand. The cool air wrapped around her as she stood at the threshold, taking one last look at the house. It was the final goodbye, not just to the house, but to the life she had once known. The phone in her pocket buzzed again, a familiar ringtone that made her heart skip a beat. She didn't need to look to know who it was. It was Malcolm. She hadn't spoken to him since that day at the cafe. He had called repeatedly, left messages, but each time she had chosen to let it go to voicemail. What was there left to say? What could he possibly say that would change anything now? Lila hesitated before pulling the phone from her pocket. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before she pressed the button to listen. His voice crackled through the speaker, his tone filled with regret. "Lila," he began, his voice shaky. "I don't know what to say. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know. I never wanted to hurt you. I was trying to protect you, but I see now that I only made things worse. I can't undo what I've done, but I'm sorry." Lila closed her eyes, his words lingering in the air. She had heard the apology, and in some way, she had already accepted it. But it wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough to erase the damage that had been done. She placed the phone down on the small table beside her, not bothering to respond. There was nothing left to say. No more words would change the past. No more apologies could heal the wounds. Taking a deep breath, Lila looked out across the street, her eyes focused on the horizon. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid. She wasn't running anymore. She was moving forward, one step at a time, with no clear destination in sight, but with the knowledge that she had the strength to keep going. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the car, her heart heavy but determined. She wasn't sure where the journey would take her, but she knew she would find her way. She had learned the hard way that life wasn't something you could control, but it was something you could survive. And survive she would. As she drove away, the house in her rearview mirror faded from sight. The last chapter of her old life closed, and she turned her attention to the future. Lila's hands tightened on the wheel, her grip steady. The road stretched out before her, long and uncertain, but she was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. The past would always be a part of her, but it didn't have to define her. She was ready to write her own story now, and whatever happened next, she would face it with strength, courage, and the unwavering belief that she could move on.